everybody. This is Debbie Q, and you're listening to The Right Shoe. The Right Shoe is a podcast about all things strange and unusual, especially in reference to a death. In this case, today's case, which is way more crazy than I remember, is 8 deaths. When I was with Lyndon, which was a joy because he helped me. It is... I'm beginning to understand why people do like 2 and 3 people on a podcast, because I'll tell you what, it's hard to remember everything. You read a case, you get into it, you submerge yourself in it. But this case, because it is something so unfamiliar to me as fishing, and there's terms like skiff, tied ends, or I don't even know. It's everything's on my notes. You know, I had to ask so many people about, what this meant, what that meant. I am not a fisherman. This case, it's just so utterly fascinating. And it's utterly fascinating to me, like the last case with the Springfield 3, with the 3 girls, Susie Streeter, Stacy McCall, and Cheryl Levitt. In the case of those 3 girls, they were never found. And the reason that case is so odd and so bizarre is that you don't even know what the motive was. And that is the most baffling of all. What was the motive? Why? Who was the target? It becomes, and that's what's with this case. This case is so complex, I better not be blabbing away. I've heard this case done on a few different shows, but when I had Instagrammed this story, I was surprised at the amount of people that had never heard of it. And I was surprised because had been a People magazine Investigate story about it. There had been, it's called Scary Mysteries. It wasn't done on Scary Mysteries, but the host, Everytown, he did the Craig Alaskan murder mysteries, but he did a shortened version, which was really good because he hit the key points perfectly. Andrew Fitzgerald, he just has a really cool voice, and he had done one. And then I'm just trying to show that it is out there, but there was always this shortened version of it. So when I read, there's a book called What Happened in Craig by Leland Hale. And there's also a very good podcast called Unresolved. Let me give a shout out. Michael Whelan delved into this. It really opened it up a little for me. I'm glad for these 2 things because without them, without the book, without this Unresolved, I don't know if I would have came to understand it. And I really wanted to do this case because getting past all the fishing references, it really is a crazy mystery. And I'm going to tell you at the end what I think happened, and because I have my own thoughts about, I don't know when I should say this. The one thing that bugs me about big cases, especially in small towns, and there's a lot. There's the John Benet Ramsey case, which to me, I will do that one day because that case drives me absolutely insane for several reasons. One thing that bugs me about big cases in, I don't want to say small towns, because if it's a big enough case, it can happen anywhere. There is such pressure to get who did it from the family, from the community, from even the ego of the people investigating. It does become a pissing match between everybody, that if you get your sights on one person or a group of people, you're just not going to let go. And you will make or try to make that fit, because at a certain point, there's so much money and time and resources put into it that you can't take back what you put in. And this is one of those cases. This is Alaska's worst unsolved mass murder. It all started with a fire. On the morning of September 7th, 1982, there was a ship. It was in Craig, Alaska, and it had caught fire. The smoke was coming out of the sides, and hours later, the fire would finally get put out. The people who go onto the boat, they thought the boat was empty. But here there was initially 4 people dead. That's how it started. But again, we have to go a little back. I'm not too far back. A couple days earlier, there was a party being thrown for a man named Mark Coulthurst. He was from Blaine, Washington, and he owned a 58-foot fishing boat called the Investor. Now, normally they said he didn't go to Craig, Alaska, but it was the salmon fishing season. He had gotten 77,000 pounds of salmon, and he was expecting a large cash haul for this, although he did not deal in cash. What happened was Mark was having a birthday party at a restaurant in Craig, Alaska, and it was at Ruth Ann's restaurant, which back then was one of Craig's few restaurants. He had come there because they had to waste a few days. He did not deal in cash. The Alaskan Department of Fish and Game had temporarily closed because of the commercial salmon fishing season closing, but they were opening that Monday. So Mark and his family and his deckhands had to stay with him. Now with him was his pregnant wife, Irene. She was 3 months pregnant. She was also 28 years old. He had a daughter named Kimberly, who was 5. His son, John, was 4. And his deckhands included Chris Heyman, Dean Moon. He was somewhat of a football star in Blaine, Washington, which Mark was also from. Jerome Keown, a 19-year-old honor student at Seattle University. He also lived in Blaine. And a Michael Stewart, who was Mark's 19-year-old cousin. These were the people that were to be on the Investor that night. Now, they didn't have any money. He did not deal in cash. He even had to write a check to somebody so he could pay the $100 bill for the food that night. After unloading the salmon haul and everything, the ship was tied to the dock. They were tied to the dock, but they were also tied to 2 other ships. The Defiant and the Decade were the names. That night, the Decade, which was owned by Clyde Curry. He was the brother of Mark Coulthurst's business partner, John Curry. They allowed him to tie to their docks because that's how they had to walk through the ships to get to their ship, the Investor. But everyone knew Mark, so even though he wasn't normally in Craig, and this kind of came up out of nowhere, he was welcomed in the fishing community. So everyone recognized him. They said Jerome Keown and Dean Moore went to grab a couple of drinks, but also purchased some weed. Okay. And they just had a good old time. As I said, he had to get the check to borrow the money. The one guy, which he says that night, because they had to pass through the 2 boats, they saw this little boy, John Coulthurst, and the 4-year-old, and he waved to them before he went to go to sleep, which breaks my heart, because this is the last time anybody would see any of the Coulthursts alive. I can see why there was a lot of confusion, because it seemed like this was the end of the salmon fishing season. And, it's like the end of a school year. You got everything going on. People are not paying strict attention to every person that walks back and forth. They did say that there was a crewman. Now, the Decade had a party that night, and it was a loud party. And there was a storm brewing. This, all the more made it easy for whoever did this to get away with it. But there was a crewman on the Decade that noticed they were called tie-down lines. And they were literally to just prevent the ships from floating away. But they're expensive, and they're used over and over again. So he saw them. They were from the Investor, but they had been left aboard the Decade. And he thought that was rather strange. That's not something that you normally do. So he looked up and he saw the Investor, and there was somebody that was in the pilot house, and he waved to him, and he assumed it was Mark Coulthurst. So he waved back. He said his size and gait were similar, but again, when life is happening, you're not paying attention to every little thread. It's hard to remember things. So he did think it was also strange that the investor wasn't running. It was idle, but it was floating away. So these things just struck him as odd, but nothing crazy. And then about 15 minutes later, the captain of the Decade, Clyde Curry, came in and remembers also seeing the investor floating away. The only thing he could remember is he said the guy had brown or blonde hair and was wearing a plaid wool jacket. That is literally all he could see. So about 7:30 on Fish Egg Island, a small island a mile away from Craig, it appeared like the investor had been anchored. They could not be sure. They just know that the investor's skiff, which I learned, is a smaller boat that like the deckhands will use to get back and forth. Say they were on the boat and they suddenly needed something from the island. Mark might say, hey, Dean, go get me something from that store. And he would use the skiff to go get whatever he needed. What wasn't known is that Kimberly, Mark and Irene's 5-year-old daughter, was supposed to start school that morning, and Irene missed her flight. So that's bad, but nothing was coming together yet. A young man was seen purchasing 2.5 gallons of gasoline in Craig, leaving with it aboard the investor's parked skiff. There was another small boat called a troller named Casino, which had been docked in Craig. They noticed smoke coming out of the investor. And not only that, but there was a couple of fishermen that noticed smoke coming out of the investor. So they alerted the Alaskan State Troopers, which in nearby Ketchikan, I hope. I hope that's the correct pronunciation, about a potential fire. And they began to head out towards because it was really starting to smoke up. Again, it wasn't tied to a dock. It was in the middle of the ocean at this point. And I do remember on I think it was the People Magazine Investigates, I'm pretty sure it was one of the shows, the police officer said there was nothing more disturbing than in the middle of boat season, you're on the dock and you see this boat come out of nowhere and it's on fire. And there's nobody on it. Like he said, that the sight was so spooky. It really stayed with him, and it would for years and years. So you have all these people. People are they're going about their business. They're trying to get home. And yet you have this boat on fire that's in front of you. They get to it. They get on the boat. They never expected what was to come. First responders would say that it was obvious that someone had tried to sink the boat. I guess they had pulled the plugs in the front. Somebody had told me the bilge pump, I guess, protects the boat from sinking. But if you mess with it in a certain way, you could make the boat sink. And that's what the person tried to do before setting it on fire. It still didn't work all the way because they did find 4 bodies burnt. This is when everything came out, like that Irene didn't get to her plane and so on. Irene was actually still wearing the same dress. So they identified Mark and Irene Coulthurst fairly quickly. When they at least got Irene and Mark off the boat, and did autopsies. They said, and this is how it was written, they did an examinations and revealed gunshot wounds to not the back of their head or execution style, but they were gunshot wounds to the head. And they would never quite elaborate on that, which makes me think they were holding something. Obviously, investigators don't always want to give all the information because they want to see, if the true perpetrator say something. The state trooper said preliminary indications are that Mark and Irene Coulthurst were victims of homicide and had died prior to the fire. And they really figured this out because nobody had carbon monoxide fumes in their lungs, which means they were dead when the fire started. So the fire didn't kill them. The gunshot wounds did, which is really disturbing because there was children. I mean, whoever kills children, It's bad to kill anybody. But there's a special place in hell for kids because they are innocent. And so, John Coulthurst, Mark's father, would tell reporters that he knew it was arson because the boat was worth $750,000 at least, and it was designed not to burn. Any widespread fire would have been intentional, not just started. And Mark was a true innovator. Like, he wanted to retire before he was 50 or at 50. And, he seemed like a get up and go guy, but he was also a guy that didn't take any shit. So I think some people, he didn't rub everyone the right way. It was, he had a hard personality. And that's usually a sign of a successful man or woman. A woman will be called a bitch, though. Well, it's a whole other story. So based on the evidence, they said, somebody had attempted to sink the boat, didn't work, and then tried to set it on fire. One of the investigators said this, which is a great freaking point. Every time I pursue something, or his name was Sergeant Charles Miller of the Alaskan State Troopers. Every time I pursue something, I keep coming up short. There's always something that doesn't fit. One thing that's stuck in my craw, why the murderer didn't burn the boat right away, or at night when there was darkness to cover his escape. There must have been a compelling reason that caused him to do it in broad daylight. That is such an interesting theory because that is true. Why wouldn't the guy, whoever this was waving in the pilot thing, why didn't he just shoot them? It seems like I agree with later theories that something must have happened. A fight started. And then somebody just went off and figured I can't have anybody knowing who I am. That's the only thing I could think of. Why else would that happen in that way? It doesn't. It's a perfect observation. In the days that would follow, they were trying to identify everybody. They finally get to identify poor 5-year-old Kimberly Coulthurst, the daughter of Mark and Irene. They identified her. They could not determine whether she had been a shooting victim because her body had been so decomposed by this point. And then days later, 19-year-old Mike Stewart, who had just started the week before, Mark's cousin and one of his deckhands, was confirmed. Jerome Keown would eventually be identified. The thing that is disturbing is Chris Heyman and Dean Moon. The remains were never found. They alleged that possibly some of the teeth were Dean's, but they never concretely identified their remains. So that also became very maddening when the trial was to start. Trials, I should say. Also, John Coulthurst, the son of Mark and Irene, the 4-year-old, he was never found either. Now, where could a 4-year-old go? Poor little Johnny. So they also found a .223 Ruger rifle, which initially was thought to have been the possible murder weapon, but because the fragments were so beat up and damaged, they just ultimately they said it was a .22 caliber firearm that shot them. I just don't think they could. None of the testing was working out because of the burn marks. And again, the carbon monoxide was not in their lungs. They were shot first. Initial reports indicated that the police were following leads involving drugs or robbery, but investigators would also publicly theorize, which I agree with, the killers had gotten into an argument with somebody, ending in somebody shooting them. And with the party going on in the decade, I guess they didn't hear the gunshot. I mean, gunshots, I have to be honest, I live near a gun range. There are times when and I live in a neighborhood that's not, sometimes people do shoot each other, unfortunately, but you cannot always tell the gunshots from the fireworks to just a strange noise. I mean, in the night, I'll think, is that a gun? Guns don't always sound like guns. I say that all the time, and it's the truth. There was somebody that was seen buying the 2.5 gallons of gasoline they just fled off into the night. They had got together a $15,000 reward, early 20s, a slim build, blonde or brown hair, which the only difference, it's a pockmarked or slightly scarred complexion with glasses with rectangular lenses. But that they said that literally described 500 men that were there that day, all for the same reason, for this salmon fishing end of season. So, and gosh, the black and red flannel, in the 90s, didn't everybody wear that? This was in the 80s. I think every single person I knew wore those red and black flannels. That was the style of dress. Somebody did say, I saw the guy in the skiff. He was watching the fire. He was one cool character. He came up, talked to a few people, made a telephone call, and left. Okay. They kept saying the same thing. The guy obviously went off the deep end. What else could have happened? They were on this boat. Somebody freaked out, shot Mark and Irene, and then figured, oh my God, I got to shoot everybody. And then really freaked out when the boat wouldn't sink, got some gas, tried to burn the boat, and then fled off into the night and was waving out the window like, hey, because, hey, I just killed 8 people, I gotta run. Or whatever. I don't know. It is so strange because if there was 8 people on the boat, that is such a freaking mystery. It's freaking me out. Think about it. There's supposed to be 8 people on this boat. 2 were never identified. Well, and John, and it wasn't the 4-year-old that did this. I don't want to get to the trial part. It's just that during the trial part, it was, somebody brought up, well, what if it was Dean? And Dean's mother ran out of the room. I have to tell that part because it's true. Like, you could see where somebody would think, well, could it have been Dean? But you don't want to think your son did that. And I'm not saying he did. It sounds crazy to me. I don't know what happened, but there had to be a 9th person, or 2 of those deckhands, Dean and Chris, went berserko. And nothing makes sense. So how would that happen? On September 10th, just a few days after the 2nd anniversary, it was September 10th, 1984, suddenly police charged someone, John Kenneth Peele, and forever, John Kenneth Peele would be the face of the Alaskan murder mystery. And this is why first of all, the picture I had showed on my Instagram was of John Peele, which in a brilliant move by his defense, he made him wear mustaches, hats, pullover hats, anything to disguise his face, because he's right. Once you get that face in your head, yeah, that's him. That's him. That's him. Of course that's him. And that's a great thing to do. That's a great tactic that even the father of one of the victims said, he's the one I would want for a defense lawyer. Suddenly they come out with John Kenneth Peele. He was a 24-year-old Bellingham, Washington native. He had been a favorite suspect for some time, and he was taken into custody. Authorities from Ketchikan, Alaska, were charging him with all 8 murders. Oh my God. And his bail was set for $1 million. They wanted to extradite Peele to Alaska for the trial. It was believed that Peele, a young man matched the description released by authorities, had been familiar with the Coulthurst family because of John Peele's alcohol and drug use, was fired as a deckhand by Mark like a year or 2 prior. And that night, it was very much argued whether John was seen talking to Mark Coulthurst. But to me, okay, I have had jobs and in a way that were less than ideal. One was completely out of my hands. It's such a long, convoluted story. I would gladly tell it to anybody that wanted to hear it. The point is, there was a time when the way that the job had ended, and I had been there 12 years, this was a different job. It ended very weird. It ended oddly. It ended because me and the manager at that time did just not see eye to eye. And I was young at the time, and regardless, I just was tired of working there. But if I seen her, I would be like, hey, what's up? I don't know. I'm just not a grudge holder. I don't forget anything, but I don't. Life is too short. Trust me. So the point is that do I think John Peele, because he got fired 2 years prior from this boat, killed 8 people? No. There had to be something more to the story, but whatever I watched never really fully explained it. And I thought there was some big pow, what do you call that? The Perry Mason movement? But there never was. It's really, they got this guy, John Peele. He failed the polygraph. I did ask homicide. I said, what do you think of polygraphs? And they said, well, they're used as a tool, but they're tools because basically it depends on who's reading the polygraph. Yes, they can be good when the person reading is fair and impartial, but that's not always the case. They said him failing a polygraph, man, when I told them this story, I always run it by them, whether they want to hear it or not. And they said it meant nothing that he failed the polygraph. Absolutely nothing. He said, you're being charged with 8 murders. The guy was probably shitting his pants. So in November of 1984, he was moved to the Ketchikan Correctional Center, and the trial was set January of 1986, where he was facing arson charges and 99 years for each of the 8 murders. They get him on trial, and the reason he was a suspect was because there was 2 separate phone calls on the tip line of individuals that said Peele should be investigated. He matched the suspect's sketch. He had been identified by 4 witnesses who claimed to see him on the skiff that day, traveling back and forth to get the gasoline. And also, this included people from the casino, the boat that first noticed the fire aboard the investor and raced out and tried to stop it. And they said that, now whether there's Peele or not, they purchased gasoline and they pretended like they were trying to stop this fire, but then they took off. And people were saying it was John Peele. He also had dated Mark's sister, and it had apparently been a tumultuous relationship that for about 3 years or so. And he got fired for the alcohol and drug use. And he was the one who sold the weed to Mark. Allegedly, he sold weed to Dean that night. The tipping point was being fired, and then he saw him that night, followed them onto that boat, passing the Decade and the Defiant. See, that's the other thing. There was 2 boats that the person had to pass. Now, if there was only 8 people on that boat, well, I guess if you're having a party, somebody snuck past, or it was, I hate to say this because it's Dean Moon's mother's reaction when it was suggested that it was Dean. I mean, that is horrible, but it had to be Dean Moon or Chris Heyman or an unknown. And I don't think it would be Dean or Chris. I mean, what could happen that would set them off so wildly? But wow, that is baffling. Peele's lawyers would argue that he had not been fired from Mark's crew, but rather decided to work aboard another ship the following year. The 2 remained friendly, and some of the Coulthurst's family members literally said on the stand, I could see my mother shooting all these people before I could John Peele. He was a gentle soul whose own wife sat behind him during the trial, and he never shown any slight. He wasn't like this hothead or a known crazed person. The relationship would always be a point of contention moving forward, with the prosecutor saying that Peele had held a grudge against Mark. And a witness recalled John Peele talking to the Coulthurst family while they attended Mark's birthday dinner at Ruth Ann's restaurant in Craig for about 10 minutes. Also reported selling Mark Mark's crew weed to Dean Moon. Now, he denied that as well, but denying and selling weed and denying 8 murders is 2 different things. I mean, as you can tell, I have to be honest, I don't believe that this guy, John Peele, did it. But I'll get to the point of what the sister of Mark Coulthurst says in the end. For starters, John Peele had no criminal history, nothing that indicated the ability for careless violence. He was a law-abiding citizen, pleasant guy. Brad Ranmel, one of John Peele's friends, told reporters he didn't have the nerve to punch anyone. I believe the killer was my mother before I believe it was him. He was the one who said it. Okay. I couldn't remember. But then there was witnesses saying John was the suspicious man they had seen in Craig. One of the men had seen young men from the skiff, originally told police about the sighting, said that he had previously known John Peele and that the man from the skiff was definitely not him. Another man that encountered the man from the skiff was shown John Peele in a photo and said, "That's John Peele. No, I know him." When you spend time, money, and when you're telling the family because you want it to be, these prosecutors are probably, driving themselves crazy. You get that into a very upset, angry family's heart that it's him. They're going to believe it. And they want to revenge, of course. Peele's, his lawyer, Philip Widener, he said the prosecutors had intimidated multiple witnesses. The allegations would come up over and over. Many of the people kept pleading the fifth because they just didn't. At this point, I just think it was getting out of hand. Maybe they were intimidating the witnesses. I don't know why they would all plead the fifth once they were up on the stand. They would also bring to light a discrepancy with the transcription of one of Peele's police interviews, which was incredibly valuable when they had gotten the grand jury indictment. Now, when you go to a grand jury is no different than a regular jury. It's filled with basically your peers. It is selected the same way a jury is, but it is usually easier for a prosecutor to get an indictment charge from a grand jury than it is a judge. That tells me even more that they went in there, John Peele was on their mind, and they were going to get him because that was the only person they couldn't find anything else. And they wanted this case solved. Now, they allege that he said, I'm scared. I can't believe the things I did in there. Peele's lawyers said that John had actually said, I'm scared. I can't believe you all think I did that. The differences between the two were striking and could have possibly influenced the grand jury into pursuing the charges against Peele. Another discrepancy, John Peele had been identified as a young man getting 2.5 gallons of gas on the morning of the Investor fire. The prosecution had failed to mention that only white gas residue had been found at the crime scene, which hinted that the killer used an accelerant to start the fire, not gasoline, which would have left behind a different type of residue. So, and not only that, but I also read, this was from the book What Happened in Craig. The author, Leland E. Hale, says that the investigators, they really didn't do themselves a good service in that they missed this one point. The expert George Bonebrake, a retired 34 veteran of FBI's latent fingerprint section, and the man who had identified James Earl Ray's fingerprint on the rifle used to kill Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Bonebrake said that this trooper should have tried to take prints from the Investor skiff on the day after the fire. The rainfall would not have washed away fingerprints made by an arsonist's fuel-soaked hands. The state had missed a trick by not having their own fingerprint expert. Better to call in a fingerprint expert to testify that they found nothing than no expert at all, because that's a great point. Why didn't they take fingerprints from this skiff? During all of this, he would wear a mask, John Peele, an elaborate disguise, fake mustaches, wigs. Now, when I first saw the story, before I heard all of this, before I read exactly what they had on him, I thought, well, why the heck is he hiding his face like that? Some of the pictures are so bizarre. Like when he has the full-on mask, I mean, he looks guilty, but you can't see his face, so you can't. But so it is an excellent tactic. You know, they were right. Why show people this guy that it might not be him? It was at the preliminary hearing, not the trial itself. When they did this, the trial itself was to begin in January of 1986. Peele's lawyers filed several motions alleging misconduct. Not only that, but John Peele's family, they just about went broke keeping him out of jail. I mean, it wasn't just John Peele's family. The community came together and raised much money. I believe it was close to $1 million bail, or at least 10% of that. So whatever, $100,000, they had to get him out, and they did. That is crazy. There was people on his side railing against the prosecutors for presenting only one side of the argument against Peele. Judge Schultz proclaimed in court, "What the hell conclusion am I supposed to draw on these facts? Do you know of any other conclusion? It's like leading a bull through a barnyard with a ring in its nose. It's a tight inference. This was suggested very clearly to the grand jury." So towards the end of that summer, Judge Schultz agreed to dismiss the charges against John Peele without prejudice, which means that he could be tried again for the same charges. The circumstances had to be different. So the prosecutors would have to refile the charges and start from ground zero. It was later learned that the potential absolving evidence, including numerous eyewitness statements from people that had seen the suspicious man on the skiff leaving the crime scene, but had purposely chosen not to identify John Peele as their guy immediately after the crime was reported. There was potential absolving evidence, and they did not put that to the grand jury, and the judge was mad. He said it was a hell of a mistake. They're going to have to go back and reindict him if they can. Judge Schultz would also refuse to cancel his $1.1 million bond, though, which had been met after a group of his friends and family got a real estate package over $1 million and held fundraisers to get this $100,000 retainer. Judge Schultz refused to validate the defense's position that the prosecutors had intimidated witnesses, stating that there wasn't enough evidence. It was somewhat of a legal defense, but I think John Peele even knew that they were pissed. So, nothing's worse than a pissed off prosecutor. Even though the trial was expected to last 2 months, they told the jurors to get ready because they were doing it again. Peele's lawyer, who would end up representing Peele for free because he viewed the state's case as preposterous, would tell reporters, "Of the many cases that I've encountered in my career, I have never seen such serious charges brought on the basis of the weak evidence reflected in this case. Although that it's unfortunate there even has to be a trial, I and Mr. Peele am looking forward to an opportunity to point out to the jury the lack of evidence." I have to say, on the few things that I've heard, besides the book, What Happened in Craig, and besides this Unresolved, I've probably seen 6 to 7 other things do the Craig Alaskan Mystery. With People magazine, I'm just a little surprised. I mean, I left away watching that show feeling like John Peele had done it and got away with it. But when I read these books and listened to this podcast, I come away thinking that John Peele was unfairly pointed out. I mean, there's nothing. If there was something earth-shattering, everyone they really went through the people that were around there during this time. The people who had been in Craig, most of them said that I heard shots, then I heard screams, but then they said they were drinking. I think I heard a woman scream. I heard a popping sound, like a generator backfiring. I wasn't sure. I was real scared. I'd never been that scared in my life. It was like that there was danger in the air, evil in the air. It was real thick. I saw John Peele standing on the dock. It looked like he might have had a rifle in his hand. Larry Denmore the captain of the ship that John Peele, okay, now we're getting somewhere. The captain of the ship that John Peele was working on at the time of the murders. I mean, he had been employed with him, and he said he identified John Peele because he was wearing the same sweatshirt and hat that Peele had often wore, and said the only gun Peele had available to him, which was usually locked up on his own boat, Larry Denmart's, had an identifiable scope on it. Denmart would later testify that Peele had decided to fly him to Bellingham instead of riding back aboard their ship. John Peele's lawyers would argue that Denmark was only testifying for the prosecution to avoid getting out of separate drug charges, and was grilled extensively about his prescription to Valium. Listen, if you have a prescription of Valium or Xanax or something like that, I do not believe it affects your memory unless you just started taking it, but somebody who's used to that kind of medication, it's not going to affect their memory, especially if they're taking it correctly. I could see if they were popping 10, 12 at a time, which I've known people to do. But if you're just taking Valium or something like that, I hate when they bring that up and try to hold that against people. That doesn't make you, dumb. It calms you down. If anything, you're more relaxed. Alice Irons, a waitress at the Ruth's Ann's restaurant in Craig, Alaska, had been one of the last people to see the entire Coulthurst family alive on the night of the murder. She's testified that she had seen the entire family with John Peele just hours before they were murdered, claiming that Peele had spoken to Mark for 10 minutes. However, when she was questioned by the defense, Irons was unable to rebut claims that she might have been confusing this counter with another. But I don't even think him talking that night would mean anything to me. That's even better. It's like, hey, how you doing? Yeah, well, we didn't get along, but everything's cool. I don't, that means nothing to me. This back and forth would carry on for several months, definitely putting reasonable doubt. The defense of John Peele, they pulled out this Joseph Waymiller, a commercial fisherman, told the court that John Peele was not the man that he had seen, whom he had told police about shortly after responding to the fire, while Miller claimed that the man he had seen was a middle-aged and stocky, perhaps of Native American origin. If you see a picture of John Peele, he is not stocky. He's a thin, at the time, very young man with blonde hair. I don't think none of which could be used to describe John Peele, who was a tall, lanky young white man. Several of the eyewitnesses that had spoken to police in the wake of the murders, many of whom had alleged the men from the skiff, said that they had excessively used John Peele in their photo lineups, putting 8 out of 29 photos of John Peele. Another thing is to make one bigger than the other, like in the picture, putting like a larger picture, a bigger face of one, to trick you out. Which just seems, I don't know, it just seems bizarre to me. I think the defense is really making a good point. I have all these notes, but I'm telling you, I had to read this over and over again because the trial is absolutely fascinating. Basically, Philip Widener would argue that the prosecutors had built a house of cards, nothing more, and it didn't hold up to scrutiny. When Philip Widener had the opportunity to question Sergeant Chuck Miller of the Elastic State Troopers, he would ask about a witness who had heard sounds of explosion once an hour for several hours on the morning of September 6th. Isn't that consistent with somebody holding the crew and executing them one by one, trying to get something from Mark Coulthurst? So Widener would claim that investigators had not looked into allegations that the owner, Mark Coulthurst, may have been involved in international drug shipping. This is another thing I heard, that he was transporting cocaine, which wouldn't go in line with what else I heard about him, which was he was very against drug and alcohol. Drugs definitely do bring about these kind of killings, because getting a kid killed, that doesn't seem like some young buck smoking weed. That seems like you screwed me on a issue. I'm trying to think, why would somebody kill 8 people? Peele's legal team will also point to additional evidence that the investigators seemed to ignore. Dean Moon had been one of the two crewmen who were presumed dead, but who had not been identified ever. There was two witnesses have reported seeing Dean Moon in 1983. One of the other arguments presented was that that Mark Coulthurst had a reputation for flying into fits of rage while drinking. This argument was bolstered by the fact that Alaska's medical examiner had noted during his examination of Mark and Irene that they had high blood alcohol levels, pointing to impairment at the time of their deaths. But she was pregnant. I'm surprised. But back then, I don't know, was alcohol, in the 80s, I don't know. Wow, that surprises me. Wow. Mark and Irene's bodies had high alcohol levels. They said it wasn't meant to be a derogatory statement against Mark Coulthurst specifically, but was meant to highlight the state's overwhelming lack of physical evidence. John Peele's lawyers would continue to petition to dismiss the charges. The defense finally rested their case in 1986 in August. Out of 11 women and 5 men that were selected in the jewelry pool and told from the get-go that they would be eliminated during the trial before reaching the deliberation phase. Eventually, the jury would be comprised of 9 women and 3 men, none of whom were sequestered but encouraged to don't talk about the case. So over roughly 25 weeks, and they spent $2 million. On August 28, 1986, following 6 days of deliberation, the jury informed Judge Thomas Schultz that they had been unable to come up with a consensus. The jury had re-listened to several hours of testimony, but none of it helped clear up their points of contention. A juror would later tell reporters that they had been leaning in favor of an acquittal, 7-5, but they had been unable to come up with a consensus. This would be the longest and most expensive trial in Alaskan state history, but did nothing to clear up the fate of John Peele, who had been 22 at the time of the murders and had yet to be found guilty or not guilty. The second trial of John Peele was originally scheduled to begin in the early months of 1987. Again, they would be a cost. The cost is phenomenal. Homicide and arson investigator James Stogsdill, who was a sergeant for the Alaska State Troopers, was one of the prosecution's standout witnesses in the retrial. Having worked on the case over years, Stogsdill was able to detail how the suspect profile had been created by law enforcement, which ultimately led to Peele as their potential killer, who not only matched the physical description, was personally familiar with the victims. Stogsdill claimed that this might have compelled Peele to murder everyone aboard the Investor, including the children, because, in his words, they might be able to ID the murderer. Sergeant Stogsdill also claimed that Peele would have known how to handle the ship, quietly sailing out to that fish egg island. He claimed that Peele's prior relationship with Mark Coulthurst and his sailing experience would have led him to effortlessly commander the Investor's skiff. Everyone says he was driving the skiff like he knew how, but I mean, didn't everybody know how to drive a skiff? And then 2 brothers from Sitka, Walter and Charles Samuel, were called to the stand to testify that John had confessed to the killings while playing cribbage with them months later. According to Charles Samuelson, John looked at me and said, "I did it, I killed them." He kind of had a weird smile. However, his brother Walter would admit to Peele's lawyers during cross-examination that he thought Peele was joking. The defense would also push back against the validity, claiming that the state had agreed to drop unrelated drug charges against one of the brothers. See, this is the thing. Every time you have to really see, if you have a witness coming to the stand and they're saying, "I saw this," or "I believe this," or "this guy did it," you got to make sure. I did that case about Keisha Jones, and her cousin was sitting in the back, and she had testified. Keisha Jones was a woman who if you didn't listen to this episode that I had done, was in Philadelphia. She got drunk one night, and with her husband, they got in a fight, and the cousin was in the back seat, and she had floored the cousin, the boyfriend gets out of the car, or the husband gets out of the car. Keisha Jones floors the car. She says her foot got stuck. The cousin in the back says her foot didn't get stuck. She floored that car and killed that man. Now, when she got on the stand, I checked everything, because my initial thought was they had to have said to her, "We're going to drop something for you to say this." And that was my initial thought. And then I looked, and she was squeaky clean. So to me, what her cousin said was true to her cousin. I always have my own thoughts about that case, but our cousin was speaking the truth, because there was nothing on the table. No, I'm going to drop this for that. Like, you always have to look at, that's the problem with the law. They're sneaky, like they shouldn't do that. There should be no, you do this and we'll take everything. It should, that bothers me. You got to just watch who's talking. Who is saying this? Is this true? What is the evidence? What is the physical evidence? This goes back and forth. There were several jabs. Philip Widener claimed that prosecutors were asking misleading questions because they were, quote, losing. The trial continued on, lasting shorter than the first trial, but still several months. After they rested their cases, John Peele's lawyers decided not to present any of their own witnesses, claiming that the burden of proof was on the state and they had failed to prove Peele's guilt. They decided that no defense was needed. And I have to say, Alaskan state prosecutor would admit that Mary Ann Henry would admit that investigators had been unable to determine John Peele's motive and had failed to obtain fingerprint matches. Ultimately, they didn't need to. The state can't tell you why the first shot was filed. The state doesn't have to prove why. The state doesn't have to prove how he did it. In their own closing arguments, Peele's lawyers would use this prosecution's case against them, claiming that the state had no motive, no murder weapon, and no physical evidence. Speculation and hearsay. They would also claim that the state failed to address how Peele, a rather slight young man, and he was small when he was young, pictures you can see, he was a skinny little thing, had overpowered 5 men, one of them a football star, and killed all 8 on board. And that I'd have to agree with. The absence of motive can raise a reasonable doubt, and it does, about this innocent man. That's what Philip Widener, Peele's attorney, had said. After making the closing arguments, the case was submitted, and they chose to acquit Peele. Yeah, it was 27 at the time that he was acquitted, and he wanted to answer one question, and they said, "How do you feel?" And he said, "It's terrible being an innocent man accused of a crime. I just thank God it's over. Justice did work this time." Philip Widener, Peele's lawyer, whose risky decision not to present any witnesses in the retrial had paid off, was much more thorough in his statement. "From the moment it was issued, I always said the indictment was not worth the paper it was written on. Prosecutors put an innocent man and his family through this ordeal for 4 years. They did go back for legal restitution. I know that Peele did ask for $150 million in damages. He settled for a little less than $1 million. But it was something he probably got to pay off everybody. In it, hey, he was acquitted. And again, he did pay off everybody. And now, even after all these years later, it just brings us to this mystery. What happened? Who did this? It's truly tragic that 8 people died. I mean, 2 people, yes, were never, well, including the 4-year-old boy. I would assume some people say that Dean Moon did this and he took the little boy John and they ran off into the sunset together. I have trouble believing that. Now on the People magazine investigates, the sister had always believed that John did this. So one day John agreed to meet with her and they had a little lunch. And she asked him straight up, did you do this? And he said, no, I did not. Now, she said she believed him, but she feels that he knows more than he's telling, which, hey, that could be true too. Why did they? Now, they were shot. Why? And why did they kill and set the fire and did all this? Obviously, I believe it to be a little more, this kind of case makes me think of either drugs or something like that. There was a party going on in the two boats that were attached. Anybody could have crossed over. And I do believe, like they said, John Peele, even with a gun, I don't think he could have overtaken all those people. I really don't. It doesn't seem from all that I read about him that it was in his makeup to do something like that. I do feel that something, Mark might have been involved in something that we don't know about. I'm not trying to disparage his name. I'm just trying to think of something, a reason strong enough, because when people are shot like that, especially children, it's usually due to a perceived, you did the like really drugs. That's the first thing that comes to my mind. So I've heard when I've read on like Reddit and stuff, people really went into the drug, like he was transporting drugs and he screwed the wrong person, especially with not having any cash. Unfortunately, that rings more true to me than some guy got fired last year. And that's a tough one. It is unfortunately a fascinating murder mystery. Again, it was his birthday. He was having a great time with his family. His wife was pregnant. His children, the girl was starting kindergarten, and then they get on this boat. And none of that was to ever happen. It's like you really gotta appreciate every day. I had someone pass away and she was young, and it was a surprise. It really makes you think. Life is very brief. Back to the investor. I strongly recommend What Happened in Craig, Leland Hale, especially if you're into fishing, because the language, the lingo, I really had to stop and ask because I didn't know what some of the terms meant. But the story itself is truly disturbing. I did get promos. I did not forget anyone's promos. It's just this case was so difficult for me. I said, I'll get to the promos. I got them all, and I'll do them. I'm not sure which one I should do next. There has been a couple, I think I'm going to do, there's been a few that were suggested to me that happened in Philadelphia or the surrounding area, which really did look interesting. So I think I'm going to do one of those before I do want to do the Wonderland murders, which was a series of it was a murder that happened one night and involved Johnny Watt Holmes, the porn star. And it happened, because of all these dates, it happened in the 80s, in the early 80s. I think it was 1981. It's a really creepy as hell murder mystery. Very creepy. Creepy because it was one of the first times that the police had used a camera to tape the evidence, and they have it all over the internet. And one night I fell into a rabbit hole and I started watching this, and it scared the living hell out of me for some reason. It just happened to be the timing and everything, and it was late. It's a good one. Other than that, that's about it. This is Debbie Q, and you're listening to The Right Shoe.